Hi, my name is Chloe. I live with my dad and robots. It could even be said that they raised me. I know it sounds strange, but it's true. For as long as I can remember, my dad has always made robots. He even works for a company that specializes in this sphere. Previously, we had only small robots in our home, and there were not many of them. They did the simplest things like mopping the floors, washing dishes, and cleaning clothes. In short, they did almost all the housework except for the cooking. That was always my mother's job. Mom loved cooking for us and gathering us at the table in the evening. She loved to listen about our day, and my dad and I loved her food. And the coolest thing was that we didn't have to wash the plates after a healthy, hearty dinner because a small robotic assistant did it for us. I could say that we had a wonderful life until one day I came back from school and saw my father who was sitting alone in the dark. Dad was sitting on the couch with his head bowed and sobbing silently. I had never seen him so broken. I came up to him and asked him what had happened and where my mother was. Dad held me and said that Mom had a car accident and she would never come home ever again. I burst into tears and then just ran to my room. After that terrible evening, I could not collect myself in any way. I became completely withdrawn and even stopped communicating with my friends at school. After school, I would come back home and then I would just go to my room. My room became my refuge, and I spent days and nights there. When Dad and I sat down to have dinner together, I didn't say a word. Dad tried to get me to talk, but he failed. Of course, I could understand that he had a hard time too. Dad completely stopped taking care of the robots, which were left broken in the corner. This was not surprising because he was very busy at work and spent a lot of time there. The house was a mess and we had a pile of dirty dishes in the sink. Sometimes I tried to clean up the house, but I also had a little time for this due to the workload at school. But one evening, Dad behaved strangely. After supper, he immediately went to the garage. I just heard the sounds of metal banging and drilling from behind the closed door. In the morning, I went down to the living room and I was so shocked that I almost fell down the stairs when I saw a dozen robots moving around the house. One of them stuck to the window and washed it. The other one was moving around and dusting the shelves and other furniture. The third one was fixing our table, and so on. There was also our old robot, the floor polisher, among them. I never thought I'd be so glad to see it. I went into the kitchen, the pile of dishes disappeared, and the robotic assistant was standing next to me on the floor, waved its arm at me. The house looked very strange because it hadn't been so clean since Mom was alive. And what about all these robots? Did Daddy bring them all together in one night? Despite the presence of many robots in the house, I had to cook breakfast for myself. After breakfast, I went to school, carefully bypassing all the robots and trying not to distract them from their work. At school, I was still alone. The girls greeted me, but I was not in the mood to answer them. I just did not want to talk to anyone. I got home late, so Dad had already made supper. He cooked rarely, and that was wonderful because after Mom's dishes, he cooked rarely, and that was wonderful because after Mom died, his cooking was disgusting. Dad spent the whole evening asking how I was doing at school. He also asked about my relationship with my friends and many other personal questions, to which I answered quite absently. He was sighing heavily every time he heard my answer. After supper, I went up to my room and lay on my bed. I was almost asleep when I heard a metallic grinding sound from the garage. In the morning, someone started jerking me from side to side. It was very strange because my dad had never woken me up before. I opened my eyes and saw a metal monster in front of me. I jumped out of bed and ran to my dad. He stood in the middle of the living room. A metal monster followed me into the room. I pointed to it and asked my dad to save me. And Dad, he just laughed. Dad went to the robot and introduced it to me. He said it was a Robotic Assistant 3000, but I could call it Betty. Betty, only after his words. I saw that the robot was a very similar structure to a woman's figure. It even wore a kitchen apron. Betty invited us to the table where breakfast was already waiting for us. As it turned out, Betty made it herself. The breakfast was amazing. It was so delicious that I almost forgot to ask my dad where Betty came from. It was unlikely that he would have been able to assemble such a complicated android in one night. Dad explained that he had assembled the robot a long time ago because he understood that we could not cope around the house without help. He simply hesitated to activate it, but after yesterday's talk, he realized that I was lonely and that I was afraid to let anyone into my life because I didn't want to lose someone close to me ever again. It was true. Dad understood me better than anyone else. Therefore, he came up with an idea which was ingenious in his opinion. He decided to assemble a friend for me because nothing bad could happen to the robot. For sure, many people would be happy to have a robot in their life, but not me. I was confused. Why did Dad decide that I needed someone? After all, I felt good alone. But even if he assumed for a second that I was lonely, how could a robot become a friend for me? All these thoughts confused me, so I decided to go to school as soon as possible. Betty stopped me with her metal hand and handed me a lunchbox. I didn't like that kind of concern, but at school, I wouldn't last long without lunch, so I took the lunchbox from her. When I was sitting all alone in the school cafeteria again, my friends walked past me. We used to be close previously, but they looked at me as if we didn't know each other at all. I felt a little sad because I had completely forgotten how to talk to people. I returned home, which literally shone with cleanliness. All these little buzzing and squeaks were not hurt anymore, and the robots were no longer in the house. After the task was completed, they left for the garage. However, I heard sounds from the kitchen, so I went there and saw Betty, who was cooking something again. It's very strange to see a robot cooking in your kitchen. So, trying to distract me from this, I took out my textbooks and notebook and started doing my homework. The kitchen had big windows, so I loved doing my homework there. One of the math problems was especially difficult for me, so I was trying to solve it for a long time. It seemed that Betty noticed it. She came up to me, then carefully took out a pencil and wrote a formula for solving the problem. Well, of course, it was so obvious. I thanked Betty for her help, and she squeaked out something in response, as that from Robot from Star Wars did. Before Daddy arrived, Betty began to run wildly around the kitchen and set up the table as a token of gratitude. I also decided to help her. I even liked doing things together rather than working alone as I used to. When my father came home, he saw Betty and me getting ready for supper, which turned out to be great, by the way. It seemed that I hadn't eaten such delicious food since my mother cooked for us. Dad was also pleased. He tried to ask how I was doing all evening, but I did not say a word. After supper, an old robotic assistant came to clean up our dirty dishes, and I went upstairs to my room. After a couple of minutes, someone knocked on my door, and then Betty came into my room. She decided to pick up my trash, then for some reason, I asked her to stay with me. After a long silence, I wanted to talk to someone, and I thought Betty, who would only listen and couldn't talk, was the best fit for this role. I chatted with her until I fell asleep. For several weeks, all I did was spend time with Betty to help her cook and then clean the house. We did my homework and even watched TV together. Sometimes I told her things that I could not share with anyone else. At first, my dad liked that I spent so much time with Betty, but then for some reason his opinion changed. Once he came to my room and said that Betty's task was to help me feel how important it was to have a friend in my life, but Betty should not be treated as a living person. He was concerned that I was spending so much time with a soulless machine. Dad added that if I didn't stop, he would have to turn it off. I became so attached to Betty that I asked him not to do this and promised him that I would start communicating with real people. But I didn't even try to establish communication with my peers. I simply didn't know what to talk about with them because all I thought about was how I would return home and tell Betty about my day. When I was chatting with Betty in the living room, my dad came in. He ran up to Betty with a decisive air and pressed some buttons on her back. Betty hung her robot head and her pixelated eyes went blank and she switched off. I was screaming at my dad to activate her again, but he just said something like, "She replaced the real world for you. You need living friends, not a robot." But how could he know what I really needed? Dad took Betty back to the garage. That night, I was laying in bed, and it seemed to me that I could hear Betty calling me for help, so I went downstairs and quietly made my way to the garage. Betty was lying in the corner since Dad hadn't had time to dismantle her. All I had to do was reactivate her. But it was not so easy because I didn't know anything about robotics. Then I decided to just click on the buttons randomly. I poked indiscriminately until I heard Betty's familiar beeping again. She woke up and hugged me. My dad walked into the garage and he heard the sounds that had come from there. Dad started yelling at me, saying that I had to turn off this robot again. Then Betty, who apparently regarded his abrupt hand movements and yelling as a threat to my life, attacked my father and began to squeeze him with her strong robotic arms. Dad's face turned blue right before my eyes, and he was randomly kicking in the air. I asked Betty to stop, and I jerked and pushed her, but it was useless. Tears rolled down my eyes. I understood that there was only one way to save my dad. I grabbed some wires in Betty's back and pulled them out in one fast motion. Betty made a beep, lowered her robot head, and unclenched her metal embrace, freeing Dad. She turned off again, This time, it was forever. It was hard to lose a loved one again, even if it was just a robot with no soul. I sat down next to my dad, who was greedily gulping air. He hugged me. Hi, everyone. My name is Jessica, and I'm the most cowardly person in the world. You can't even imagine how many fears I have to face every day. And my story will be about me and my life. When I was a kid, my relatives called me a daredevil and said that I would become a female soldier or stunt woman. I used to be very swift and fearless. Once, I even climbed up on the balconies of the 5th floor without any safety equipment because I forgot my keys at home. Now, I'm scared to even recall it. But then, it seemed to me a cool and fun adventure. I can't believe that was actually me. It all started changing suddenly when I was about 11. Then I was nearly hit by a car when I was crossing the road hurriedly in the wrong place. I heard the brakes squeal. I could smell the burnt rubber and the driver yelling. It was a miracle that he didn't hit me. The car stopped a couple of centimeters from me. Isn't that a miracle? I remember that incident in detail and still experience primal fear recalling it. I was at death's door because of my stupid pseudo-courage, and I was nearly bereft of life. How could I be so self-assured and stupid? Thus, I got my first phobia, a fear of cars. At first, I was afraid of only moving cars, but then the fear of cars in general was headed to this. I won't call every phobia in scientific language now, if you don't mind. I think describing my fears will be enough. Can you imagine what it's like for me to go out and see cars everywhere, literally at every turn? Every time I left my house, I faced a real challenge. Once I was just walking and a car honked. I got so scared that I climbed up a tree very high, and then I couldn't climb down. Since then, I've developed 3 new phobias, including a fear of loud noises, especially cars honking, a fear of trees, and heights. You know, I believe that it was the perfect time to stop playing tricks on my psyche. But the universe decided to do otherwise, and phobias began to literally cling to me from all sides, one by one. One day, my mother invited me to dinner. There were some dishes and drinks on the table. There were peaches in the center of the table. I hadn't eaten them since last summer, and I liked them very much before. But that time, I completely forgot how much I liked them because those furry monsters triggered a panic attack. I screamed and creeped under the table, telling my mother to hide them as far away as possible. Thus, I got a fear of peaches. I'll say that when I started going to a mental health counselor, it turned out that 5 out of 10 of his patients decided to start therapy because of the fear of peaches. It's funny, silly, ridiculous. Why peaches? I really want to know the answer to this question. A little later, watermelons and melons were put on the list. However, peaches remain my main fruit phobia. I get goosebumps, and I want to scream and cry when I just think about them. There was a small fire at our house when I forgot to turn off the stove and was surfing the internet. I managed to put out the fire and avoid terrible consequences. But after that incident, I got several new fears at once, namely a fear of fire, loss of memory and just forgetfulness, electric stoves, and the internet, which was a real nightmare because I could no longer even get out of bed. My fears overwhelmed me so much and kept me under constant stress that even going to the kitchen became a real challenge for me. When my mother couldn't persuade me to eat something once again, at that time I already had a fear of food. She started sounding alarms, and soon I was sent to a special clinic that specializes in dealing with phobias. There, I worked on my fears step by step with a psychotherapist as a mentor. So I gradually returned to my previous state. I must admit, it wasn't easy. Sometimes I would slip up and start getting scared of something again. In total, I spent 6 months in the clinic. I lived away from home and studied at school remotely. Then they let me go home. Since the mentor thought that I had completely gotten rid of my phobias, I thought so too, but only for the first 2 months. And then strange things began to happen to me again. I hoped it wasn't fear, but unfortunately, I was wrong. Since I hadn't come in contact with groups of people for a long time, I came to school and had a panic attack right away. There was a huge number of people around, and I began to see double because there were so many of them, and the voices of my classmates merged into a single loud laughter so that I couldn't figure out what they were saying. It seemed to me that I was in a huge anthill, so I screamed and huddled myself up in the corner. An ambulance took me away, and I never showed up at that school again. From then on, I had to study online again, overcoming my fear, but it was the better of the two evils. Soon my parents decided to switch me off from everything that was happening and arranged a picnic. Indeed, I was still afraid of trees, but I tried to control myself. Then I decided to drink some water and choke slightly. It would seem that it was no big deal, but not in my case. I had a panic attack right there and started running away from my parents. It all ended with me getting lost. Fortunately, they found me quickly, but this added a whole new stack of phobias. Now I had a fear of water, panic attacks, nature getting lost, drowning, and running. After that incident, I started going to a psychotherapist again, but I didn't live in the clinic that time. The doctor tried to pull out all my fears and help me overcome them again, but the effect was temporary. Again, because when I got into even a slightly stressful situation, the phobias were back and they were much more intense. And then the psychotherapist said that basically I was completely healthy and I didn't need medical help. Indeed, I had phobias like most people. I simply had more of them and I just needed to learn to live with them. I thought he had a point. He was right on the whole, and I should follow his advice. But living surrounded by phobias and fears was a real torment. Nevertheless, I still decided to live a normal life. The first step was going back to school. Well, it was a real feat for me, considering that it was a different school. On the first day, I tried to hold on for several hours, but then I couldn't stand it anymore and ran away, sending a teacher sprawling on my way. Meanwhile, I fell down as well, hit my head against the wall, and fainted. I had a concussion and had to stay at home again, but this time the enclosed space put pressure on me, triggering a new phobia. I got a fear of being at home, not only at home, in the elevator, in the store, everywhere. At the same time, I was afraid of open space. I was afraid of animals, insects, rain and lightning blows, concussions, and any other diseases, teachers, doctors. The list was endless. They say we draw our fears to us for a reason. Once I got stuck in the elevator with 2 doctors during a thunderstorm. My head nearly exploded from the number of fears per square meter. Tell me, why does it happen to me all the time? I spent almost an hour in that trap, and it seemed to me that I died and came back to life several times. The doctors, by the way, weren't happy to be near me at all. Of course, no one would like to spend so much time with a crazy person who screamed, cried, beat herself against the walls, and tried to get out through the closed doors. After the elevator incident, I was back in the psychotherapist's office. That time, we found almost 100 phobias. You heard that right, almost 100. An average person may have 1 or 2 phobias. Well, 5 tops. I think I had all of them. How is this possible? In fact, I turned into a walking phobia myself. Then the doctor gave me the task. Whenever I faced one of my fears, I had to abstract my mind from the situation and look at it as if I were an onlooker. There was Jessica, and there was her fear. I was just watching. I followed his advice, and it even began to help me. But I realized that I was so used to living with my fears and phobias that I no longer reacted to them so strongly and violently. My psyche had already adapted to life in constant fear, and it seemed to not care about it anymore. Thus, all my phobias softened and weakened considerably. I am so happy about it. I started going to school again. I began to communicate with my classmates and even hang out with them. But one phobia is still in my head. Probably, I should tell you its name. It's a phobia, and that is a fear of phobias. Now, this is my main fear, and I can hardly ever get rid of it. I'm scared to return to a state of eternal fright again when horror awaits me at every turn.
Hey guys, my name is Murphy, and I have a very small sister, Sandra, who can drive anyone crazy at the same time. She has a wonderful temper. She is very sweet and calm. These characteristics do not really fit together, do they? I think I know the reason for this inconsistency. Most likely, Sandra is 053 SCP object. My sister hasn't even turned 3 yet. She is very sociable. My sister hasn't even turned 3 yet. She is very sociable and intelligent at her age. She learns long poems by heart and even reads books on her own. She also loves my parents and me very much. She always shows real tender feelings for us. It might seem that she is a real angel. However, the thing is that she only gets along well with kids like her or a little younger, while causing uncontrollable bouts of anger in everyone else, including Dad and me. Anyone who spends more than 8 to 10 minutes with her starts hating her and wants to hurt her in some way. Perhaps I will repeat it once again, that Sandra does absolutely nothing that can drive a person crazy. She has not yet learned how to be angry or mean or lie. She is the sweetest child I have ever known. But as soon as I stay with her for a terrible 10 minutes, I'm ready to kill her with my own hands. And I hate myself for that, but it was always like that. It so happened that just as soon as we moved to a new city, Sandra was born, and first everything was fine. I mean, my sister did not cause anger attacks on my parents, and we doted on her. I was glad and proud that I had Sandra, and dreamed of how we would really get along with her and play football together. Yeah, you heard it right. Real football. Girls play it too, and sometimes they're as good at it as boys. When we were moving, we did not know anyone at all at the new place, and for a long time we communicated only with each other. It wasn't really fun, but we coped with it. But then we still began to build connections and find new friends. Once, in a hairdressing salon, my mother met a very pleasant and sweet woman who always had 2 children about the same age as Sandra. My mum was so happy about getting the first acquaintance that she invited her and her family to visit us that very evening. We've spent several hours buying groceries and preparing the best possible dishes. We were very glad when our new acquaintances came to visit us. The evening was going to be active and interesting because the son of that woman, Michael, turned out to be my real soulmate. We really had a lot to talk about. Sandra was asleep at that time, and just at the end of the evening woke up and cried a little. Of course our guests wanted to get to know her too. It took no longer than 5 minutes, and then my mother asked Michael and me to take his small sister and Sandra to our room. We decided to play a little with the kids, pretending to be squeaking ducks and using various rustling objects because we both really loved children. But after about 10 minutes, strange things started happening to Michael. Suddenly, from a cheerful and kind guy, he turned into a spawn of hell and began to shout that he hated Sandra. He tried to grab her, but I managed to stop him, but holding him back was not easy at all. His face turned red and his eyes were bloodshot. Fortunately, our parents appeared in the room right away and tied him with a bedsheet. Mum immediately picked Sandra up and started asking what was going on there, and I told her everything. Meanwhile, Michael continued to shout and threaten my sister. When everything became clear to my parents, they asked our guests to leave and said that they should have warned my family that their son could be aggressive and weren't supposed to leave him unattended. But Michael's parents were as shocked as everyone else, and they said that they did not understand what had happened and that they were seeing their son in such a state for the first time. But still, our guests left almost immediately, and we never met them again. Less than a month had passed before another egregious incident occurred. On that day, Mum and Sandra went to the doctor by bus since Dad did not have enough time to drive them there by car, and no one could even imagine what outcome such a trip would have. About halfway through, the facial expression of one of the girls sitting next to my mum changed, and she began screaming that she would kill Sandra, and then got up and tried to take her out of my mum's hands. Other passengers began to stand up for my mum, but then they started taking the side of that crazy girl, one after another, as if some kind of virus infected their brain and was actively spreading throughout the bus. Fortunately, the bus stopped and the doors opened. By a miracle, my mum managed to rescue Sandra and escape from that place. She had to walk on foot for the rest of the day. She was sobbing and did not understand what these people wanted from her daughter and why they hated her so much. That day, the visit to the doctor took longer than usual. While in most cases it was quite formal and lasted about 5 to 7 minutes, this time Mum and Sandra had to stay there for a long time because after the incident on the bus, Mum was anxious and due to her state asked the doctor the same question several times. At some point, the doctor's facial expression suddenly changed. He angrily glanced at Sandra and tried to snatch her out of Mum's hands. But my mother was already familiar with such a glance, so she immediately ran away and asked my dad to come and take them home because she was already afraid to show Sandra to anyone. We had no idea what to do and where to look for help. Will doctors save us? Well, no. We saw one of them the day before. What about exorcists? But my parents and I are skeptics, so we do not believe in all the nonsense like that. So only the police remained. We decided to write a statement against the crazy doctor, while also telling about other episodes when strangers tried to attack Sandra. We hoped that the police would help us figure out what was going on. The statement was accepted, and the proceedings began. The doctor was suspended from his professional duties and fully admitted his guilt. Moreover, he came to our house in order to apologize. The doctor said that he did not understand what happened to him that day. He described the condition. He said that he could not take control of his mind and body, as if he was possessed, and he had no explanation for this. Then Sandra came out of the living room. There were tears in the doctor's eyes, and he said that he did not know how he could hurt such an angel. Mum asked him to provide at least some assumptions, and he began to sell something about biochemistry, but we really did not understand anything because suddenly he tried to attack Sandra again. That was why the doctor went straight to jail from our house. From that day on, we decided not to show Sandra to anyone else. More precisely, we didn't allow anyone to look at her for more than 5 minutes. This was not easy, but when it comes to the life of a loved one, all the challenges are quite easy to cope with. However, a few months later, a new shock awaited us. It occurred when I was playing with Sandra in the living room and my parents were watching TV. Unexpectedly for everyone, this was as if some all-consuming force was waking up in me, and I almost pounced on Sandra. She was saved by the reaction of our dad, who quickly removed her from my way and stood between us. Later, when I had come to my senses again, I was unable to explain to my shocked parents what had happened. At that moment, I could just not control myself. Everything was exactly as the doctor described, and it was terrible because it concerned me. I hated myself for it. From that day on, my parents limited my communication with Sandra to 5 minutes at a time. But Dad was next. After a while, he started having outbursts of anger towards Sandra. Our whole family was going crazy because of hopelessness, and Sandra did not understand why she could not spend as much time with Dad and me as she wanted. One day, some people came to our house and introduced themselves as parapsychologists. They said they could help us, but for that, Mum and Sandra would need to move to their clinic for some time. We understood that this was the only hope for Sandra and our family, so we had to agree and sign all the documents. More than a month had passed since my mother and sister went to the clinic. They called us sometimes, but it was strictly forbidden for my mum to tell us exactly where they were and to meet with us. But recently I came across the information about 053 SCP objects and realized with horror that it was Sandra. Do you have the outbursts of anger? Share your responses in the comments. Click on the thumbs up button below the video and subscribe to the channel.